Welcome back to Legal Alternative Podcast. I'm here, SamPawson, joined 2 weeks in a row by Nils. Nils, how are you?
I'm good. Glad to be in Leeds again.
Yes, not quite as hot as last week, where I think we were melting. So back on the pod, an interesting pod this week. I think I'm going to kick us off. I'm going to talk about the world of probationary periods. We were talking before on Nils. The method in the madness today is obviously probation periods are going to become really important in January, and obviously are important already. But we've talked about at length a change in qualifying period from 2 years to 6 months. So before we get there in January, I wanted to put a quick pod out about probation periods and really probably a misconception that some of our clients, I'm sure some of the listeners have, that if an employee is in their probation period, you can just let them go and there's no risk to the company, which, as you'll know better than anyone, is not quite true. Although we have obviously greater freedoms currently within that first 2 years and from January, that first 6 months. So whenever we talk about probationary periods, the starting point really is that what we're talking about is risks of claims. And in that probationary period, actually, what you have is not an automatic fair reason for termination. So when we talk about unfair dismissal, the expiry or the unsuccessful completion of a probationary period isn't a fair reason. We're still on conduct, capability, redundancy, illegality, some other substantial reason. So actually, what do we look at in a probationary period? They are useful generally for two things. One is that there's often a link to notice and a change in notice period. So in someone's contract, often in a probationary period, if the company decides to terminate that person's employment, the probationary period may only be a week, whilst once they've got over that probation period, it might be a longer period, 3 months, 6 months, whatever that might be. So there is some impact there. More importantly, I think for me is a general acceptance from employees that they understand what a probationary period is, even if that maybe not kind of linked to the law, that there is a general exception that, oh, I've not met probation, that must mean that the company can let me go. Again, as we've said, not accurate in the law, but I think that the concept of it is at least helpful. So what do we actually look at, and what in January are we going to look at? Because come January, we've talked about a lot, we're going to have to make quick decisions. So if we are in a probationary period, we don't have free rein, and we still have to be conscious of what I generally categorize as 3 types of claims, where an employee, irrespective of their service, can challenge the fairness of their dismissal. So 3 broad groupings for listeners to be aware of. The first is the big one, which is discrimination. So from day one, and actually we talked about another podcast, pre-day one, any employee worker has a right to say, I feel I have been discriminated against. And often linked to probationary periods, it would be the failing of that probation period and the termination of their employment. They have suffered what we would call a detriment. And what the employee would have to show is that is linked to a protected characteristic. So I won't go through every protected characteristic. And I think most of our listeners will be aware that covers issues like age, disability, sexual orientation, where they would say, actually, the reason that the company's failed my probationary period is because I hold this protected characteristic. So the burden of proof is on the employee, and they would have to link the dismissal to that protected characteristic, which is far from clear, but that is often the biggest risk. So when we're advising clients of dismissal in a probationary period, it is always to point out, well, is there a risk of discrimination? I would say that probably the most common one that we see is disability discrimination linked to periods of ill health, where you have an employee who quite early in their working journey becomes ill, periods of absence, periods of poor attendance. The company therefore says, well, your attendance has been poor, failed your probation period, we're going to terminate your employment. It's to be aware of that risk. And that's not to say you can't dismiss, you need to be conscious of that dismissal. The other 2 broad categories of claims, as there's technically more, but what I would group them into is 2 claims in what we call automatic unfair dismissal. So they link broadly to two overall concepts. The first is what we call whistleblowing or a protected disclosure, where the employee has said, I have made a whistleblowing complaint. And the claim is that because they have made that whistleblowing complaint, their employment has been terminated. So your world, an employee says, I've got concerns at work about your health and safety. Yep. I'm making a disclosure about that. The company then say, we failed your probationary period, and there is a causal link to that disclosure. Similarly, the final category is what we call an assertion of the statutory right. So again, employees have hundreds and hundreds of statutory rights, ones that kind of common ones people are unaware of, and national minimum wage, working time regulations, family-friendly leave, paternity, maternity, where they're saying, I am going to claim that statutory right. So using the minimum wage example, you haven't been paying me minimum wage. That is my statutory right. Yeah. The employee then terminates their employment. Again, a causal link. Both those are what we would call automatic unfair dismissal. So that's what I want our listeners to be kind of being aware of, and really to think now about these probationary periods. That one, if we're having them, what are we doing? So is it a review? When are these reviews taking place? We've got this 6-month window. We talked in the previous podcast, I'd probably be looking at before 6 months to have that review, 5 months, 4 months at least. And then critically in that review to go through those risks that we've just talked about. So if there is a sickness, absence, poor attendance, is it linked to a disability? Has there been any disclosures? Has there any complaints, grievances made? And that almost is an internal form for the company to go through a checklist that says, what's the issue? Is the probation period passed or failed? And if it's failed, can we identify any of these risks? Yes. Because that's what we need to be looking at. If we are going to a world that we believe there's going to be more dismissals in that first 6-month window, we need to be really clear as organizations that we're assessing that risk properly. So as always, this is not a podcast to say you can't do this, you must do this. It's to be conscious of your risk when doing so. Views, anything I've missed, anything you've kind of practically want to add to that, Nils?
I think what I saw in practice when I did more employment was half the battle has actually been organised. Yeah. So if a 2-year period, you're taking a look at someone and still struggling at the end of that, getting to the end of that, 6 months is going to be an extreme challenge. So I think a lot of it is about being organised, having the structure in place, because 6 months will go like that. What will happen, I think, I agree with you, I think there's going to be a lot more dismissals. I think it could be seen as a positive by business because it will flush out quicker issues, hopefully. But it is about that awareness, and we've both had cases where people have been dismissed for those reasons, particularly something like a health and safety concern, and the knowledge just hasn't been there. So again, as always, we say every week, it's about taking advice, isn't it?
Taking advice, and I completely agree with you, Nils, documenting it. And any listeners wanting some specific advice, we can share kind of what a probation review would look like. Having those kind of documents that would identify risk, not to share with the employee, but as an internal aid memoir to say, this is what we're looking at. If there is going to be a failure of that probation period, what are the risks? Yeah. Have we assessed those risks? If there may be cases where there is a risk and there's still a commercial decision that we need to terminate that person's employment, absolutely fine, understand that. But at least we're aware and conscious of the risk while going in would always be sensible. And then, as we say, you can take advice on the most risky issues and we can plan accordingly.
And that would be a disclosable document as well. So if it's a different reason to what the employee is putting forward before a claim is even being considered, I think that's pretty powerful evidence as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So probation periods, as I say, laws changing. I think we've talked to death. So January we'll put more updates around this, but I think the time is now to be looking at your probation periods. We're going to quickly come into January, and then that clock will already be ticking. So something to act now on. Over to you. I think quick update from you this week now.
Very quick update back to immigration law once again. So the government has 2 months to respond now to the House of Lords Justice and Home Affairs Committee, who've published their report on settlement, citizenship and integration. So they want the government basically to have a look again at what the government's called the earned settlement proposal. They've actually asked for it to be redesigned. So for example, income thresholds for settlement reductions. This committee doesn't want them to follow and track tax proposals. So they have put forward that the better way of perhaps doing this is look at the fiscal contribution of that individual, public financial impact and regional labour market. They've also, interestingly, opposed extending the indefinite leave to remain baseline to 10, 15, 20 years. They've said perhaps look at keeping this at a 5-year level, but separate indefinite leave to remain from access to public funds. So it would keep indefinite leave to remain, the qualification period at 5, but it might be, for example, a 10-year period where you can't access particular funds. They've also said that rejecting retrospective applications to those already in qualifying routes. So you might be in the UK working toward that 5-year period. Now they've called that manifestly unfair and reputationally damaging to the UK. So we'll see what the new government comes back with in 2 months' time. I suspect we'll have a raft of very different things to speak about.
Yeah, we talked again, obviously, time of recording, we still not got a new Prime Minister. We obviously all avenues are pointing to Andy Burnham. Obviously, we don't yet have any firm policy statements.
No. We
always look at kind of winds and shades on this podcast, and is there starting to be a slight change? And again, this review may back that up, and we will see. It seems like going to be another changeable time in your world.
Yeah, I think so.
Perfect. And that's all this week. Quick podcast, two important updates. As always, if there's a topic you'd like to explore, both Nils and I love to present on it. Any ideas shared of us. So please leave us a comment, like the podcast, follow the podcast, find us on LinkedIn. Both of relatively active on LinkedIn. So all links will be there. Subscribe to our weekly updates to the Monday Morning Dispatch, and as I say, always give us a like to these videos. So thanks so much for listening, and it's goodbye for me.
And for me, thank you.